The pale winter sun barely pierced through the clouds, casting long shadows across the quiet city park. The snow-covered ground stretched endlessly, the sound of boots crunching on snow the only disturbance in the silence. In the middle of it all sat a man in a wheelchair, his dark skin almost blending with the shadows. His face was calm, his eyes sharp and alert, exuding a quiet strength. Next to him, a large black dog walked on a leash, its fur thick and wild like a wolf's. The dog was the only movement in the otherwise still scene, its eyes scanning the surroundings. The man's hand rested gently on the dog's back, as if sensing its unease. Despite the winter chill, a calm aura surrounded them, as if the park itself was holding its breath. But that peace wouldn't last. A group of young men, dressed in hoodies and leather jackets, appeared at the edge of the park. They had been lingering nearby, and their eyes immediately locked on the man in the wheelchair. One of them, tall and thin, pointed at him with a smirk. "Look at this, guys," he sneered. "A black guy in a wheelchair. What, can't walk, but still taking his dog for a stroll." The others laughed, their laughter harsh and mocking. It wasn't friendly, it was filled with contempt. One of them, a stocky guy with a scar on his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the man in the wheelchair. "What's the matter, man?" he taunted. "You too lazy to get up? Just sitting there, like you don't care about life?" The man didn't respond. His gaze remained steady, his face unreadable. He knew better than to engage. But as the group circled around him, their words grew sharper, more personal. "What's it like, huh?" Another one mocked. "Can't even stand up, can you? Just sitting there, like some useless thing." The man's grip tightened on the wheelchair's armrests, but he said nothing. The dog began to growl softly, its muscles tense, sensing the rising danger. "Hey, what's this?" The stocky guy bent down to look at the dog. "You think you're tough just because you've got a dog with you? You're nothing but a cripple." The man's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to the group. He could feel the situation escalating, but he kept his composure. He had been in tough situations before, and he knew how to stay calm. But the gang wasn't backing down. They were enjoying this, pushing him further. Without warning, one of them lunged at the dog, grabbing its collar and yanking it hard. The dog barked loudly, trying to break free, but the guy held on tightly, laughing as the animal struggled. "Let her go," the man said, his voice sharp, yet calm. The gang stopped laughing, but the stocky guy just grinned wider, tightening his grip on the collar. "What are you gonna do about it, cripple?" he taunted, pulling harder. The man's eyes darkened. The dog barked again, more urgently this time. The man's hand moved to the dog's head, stroking it gently, trying to calm her down. But the situation was spiraling. "You think you're tough because you're sitting in that chair?" Another voice sneered. "You're nothing but a joke." The words hit harder than any physical blow. The man's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He refused to let them provoke him. But the gang wasn't finished. They were enjoying every second of this. Then, just as the stocky guy reached out again to grab the dog, a voice rang out from behind them. "Hey, stop it right now." The gang froze. They turned to see an elderly man, dressed in a fine coat, walking briskly toward them. His face was stern, filled with disapproval. He stepped in front of the wheelchair, trying to intervene. "What do you think you're doing?" the elderly man demanded. "This is a person, not some target for you to mock." But the gang wasn't intimidated. The stocky guy shoved the elderly man aside, sending him sprawling into the snow. The man in the wheelchair's eyes narrowed, his calm starting to crack. And then, in a voice that was calm but filled with authority, he spoke. I'm the mayor of this city." The words hit like a bombshell. The gang froze, their laughter dying in their throats. The stocky guy, still holding the dog's collar, looked confused. "What?" he muttered, not understanding. "What are you talking about?" The man in the wheelchair didn't repeat himself. He simply looked at them, his eyes filled with quiet authority. One of the bystanders, watching the scene unfold, pulled out his phone. "It's him. It's really him," the bystander shouted, pointing at the man in the wheelchair. "It's the mayor." The gang's faces turned pale. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They had just attacked the mayor. The man they had mocked, humiliated, and pushed around was the very person they had disrespected. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The gang stood frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. The realization hit them like a freight train. They had just humiliated the mayor of the city. The man they had mocked, the man they had pushed and insulted, was the very person they had been disrespecting. The words, "I'm the mayor of this city," echoed in their minds, growing louder with each passing second. For a moment, there was only silence. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the entire park was holding its breath. The dog, still growling, stood protectively by the man's side, her eyes locked on the gang. The man in the wheelchair didn't move, his gaze unwavering. He was calm, but there was something dangerous in his stillness. The gang could feel it. The tension was palpable, suffocating. One of the young men, the one who had been the loudest, broke the silence. He took a hesitant step back, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was pale, his lips trembling. He had been the first to taunt the man, the first to escalate the situation. Now, he was realizing the gravity of his actions. The stocky guy, still holding the dog's collar, looked at the others, his hands shaking. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't find the words to apologize, to explain. There was nothing he could say to undo what had just happened. The man in the wheelchair spoke again, his voice cold and firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You should have thought about the consequences before you started." His words hung in the air, heavy with authority. The gang didn't move. They stood there, paralyzed by fear, their earlier bravado gone. They had crossed a line, and they knew it. They had attacked the mayor, a man who held power, who had the resources to make their lives a living hell. One of the bystanders, the elderly man who had tried to intervene earlier, had already pulled out his phone and called the police. He stood a few steps away, watching the scene unfold with a mix of concern and disbelief. His voice was shaky as he spoke to the operator. "Yes, there's a group of young men attacking a man in a wheelchair. I'm not sure who he is, but wait, what? You're saying he's the mayor?" The elderly man's eyes widened in shock. The realization that the mayor had been the victim of the assault sent a chill down his spine. He looked at the gang, then back at the man in the wheelchair. The tension in the air was thickening, suffocating everyone in its grip. The gang's nervous glances were interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The police were on their way, and they were running out of time. The stocky guy looked around as if hoping for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The weight of the situation was crashing down on him. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew it wouldn't be good. "You're done," the man in the wheelchair said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable edge. "You'll answer for this. All of you." The gang flinched at his words, but none of them spoke. They couldn't. The power in his voice, the calm authority, made them feel small and insignificant. They were no longer the ones in control of the situation. They had crossed a line, and now they would have to face the consequences. The sirens grew louder, closer. The police were almost there. "Don't move," the man in the wheelchair commanded, his eyes narrowing. "Stay right where you are." The gang hesitated, their eyes shifting nervously between each other. They were trapped. There was no way out now. The realization that their actions had consequences, that they had gone too far, hit them all at once. The weight of their stupidity was crashing down on them, and they could feel the walls closing in. As the first police car screeched to a halt, the officers rushed out, their hands on their holsters. They quickly assessed the situation, their eyes scanning the group of young men, then shifting to the man in the wheelchair. The bystanders, including the elderly man, stepped back, allowing the police to take control. The stocky guy, still holding the dog's collar, looked at the officers, his face pale with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this, how to explain himself, but he knew there was no way out. The truth was undeniable. The mayor had been attacked, humiliated, and now they would have to pay for their actions. The officers moved swiftly, their voices sharp and commanding. They began to separate the gang members, pulling them aside one by one. The stocky guy was the first to be handcuffed, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. The others were quickly apprehended, their attempts at excuses falling flat. The man in the wheelchair remained silent, watching the scene unfold with a calm that only made the situation more unnerving. He had already seen this before. The fear, the panic, the realization that there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. As the last of the gang members was taken away in handcuffs, the man in the wheelchair finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "This is just the beginning. You'll face the full consequences of what you've done. And the city will know what kind of people you are." The officers nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. The bystanders, still in shock, exchanged nervous glances. They had witnessed something that would change the city forever. The man in the wheelchair turned to leave, his dog at his side. The park, once filled with tension, now felt eerily quiet. The gang members were gone, their fate sealed. But the mayor, had won. The battle for justice had only just begun. And as he wheeled away, the city's future seemed a little brighter, but the road ahead would be long, and the echoes of this day would reverberate for years to come. The cold night air seemed heavier than usual, as if the city was holding its breath. News of the mayor's assault had spread quickly, and by the time the sun set, the streets were alive with whispers, rumors, and growing outrage. People were glued to their phones, waiting for the next update, unsure of what to make of the situation. The mayor sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pressing on him. His wheelchair was positioned at the head of a long conference table, his dog resting quietly at his feet. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls, and the silence felt suffocating. He was calm, but the unease gnawed at him. The police had done their part, the gang was in custody, but the real battle was just beginning. A knock on the door broke the silence. His chief of staff, Rachel, entered, her face tired, her eyes filled with concern. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "It's getting out of hand." The mayor nodded, gesturing for her to sit. The situation had escalated faster than he had anticipated. The media was already spinning the story, some focusing on the gang members' youth, others questioning whether the mayor's response was too harsh. "What's the latest?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Rachel glanced at her tablet. Protests are already being organized. The first one's tomorrow afternoon. They're calling it a rally for justice, but it's clear some people are using it to push an anti-government agenda. There's talk of more violence if things don't go their way. The mayor leaned back, his mind racing. He had expected resistance, but this was more than he had hoped for. The city was divided, and he knew the storm was coming. "We need to control the narrative," he said, his voice cold with resolve. "This isn't just about me. It's about the city. If we let them twist this into something it's not, we'll lose everything we've worked for." Rachel nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What do you want to do?" The mayor took a deep breath. "We'll address the protests head-on. I'll speak tomorrow, but it's not just about the gang. It's about the bigger picture. We need to remind people that we stand for something. We don't tolerate hate or violence. If they want to protest, let them. But they'll do it under our terms." Rachel hesitated, concern flickering in her eyes. "Are you sure? This could get ugly." The mayor nodded, his expression unwavering. "I've faced worse. We'll show them what real leadership looks like." The next day, the city was on edge. The protest had grown larger than expected, with hundreds of people gathering in the heart of downtown. The air was thick with tension, and the police were out in full force. The mayor's speech was scheduled for noon, and as the time drew closer, the crowd grew restless. Some chanted slogans calling for justice for the gang members, others demanded the mayor's resignation. The mayor wheeled onto the stage, his dog by his side. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak. "Today, we stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice steady. "What happened in that park was wrong. But it wasn't just wrong because of who was involved. It was wrong because it was a reminder of the hate that still festers in our society. Hate that we allow to grow unchecked." The crowd was listening now, the tension palpable. "We cannot allow this city to become a place where hatred and violence are tolerated. We cannot allow a few misguided individuals to dictate how we live. We will not let fear control us." The crowd stirred, some nodding in agreement, others murmuring in dissent. But the mayor's words were having an effect. He could feel it. "I will not back down," he continued, his voice strong. "And I will not let this city fall to hatred. We will rise above this. Together." For a moment, the crowd was silent. Then, slowly, the first cheers began. Quiet at first, hesitant. But they grew louder, more confident, until the entire square was filled with applause. But not everyone was convinced. From the back of the crowd, a lone figure raised a sign that read, "Justice for all." The message was clear. The battle wasn't over. As the mayor wheeled off the stage, he knew this was only the beginning. The storm had only just begun to break, and the city would never be the same again. The day after the mayor's speech, the city was divided like never before. News outlets were flooded with coverage of the protests, with some framing the mayor as a hero standing up to hate, while others painted him as a power-hungry leader suppressing the voices of the people. The city's streets were filled with tension, as if the air itself was thick with the weight of the conflict. The mayor had expected some backlash, but he hadn't anticipated the full force of what was coming. The protests continued to grow, more organized and more volatile with each passing hour. A second rally was planned for the evening, and rumors spread that it would turn into a full-scale confrontation. The mayor sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the window. The weight of the decisions he had made was starting to settle in. He had expected resistance, but now, as the unrest grew, he wondered if he had underestimated the depth of the division in the city. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced down at the message. "We need to talk." "Urgent?" It was from Rachel. He quickly dialed her number. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but tense. "The situation's getting worse," Rachel replied, her voice strained. "The second rally is already starting to turn violent. There are reports of clashes between protesters and counter-protesters. The police are struggling to keep control. And there's talk of more attacks on government officials." The mayor's stomach tightened. He had hoped things would calm down after his speech, but it was clear that this was far from over. "What's the plan?" he asked, his mind racing. "We need to act fast," Rachel said. "We've got to address the violence head-on. If we don't, it could spiral out of control. The city is already on edge. We need to show that we're in control, that we won't let this chaos tear us apart." The mayor was silent for a moment, weighing his options. He knew that any move he made now would be scrutinized. But he also knew that he couldn't let the city descend into chaos. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. "I'll address the people again," he said finally, his voice resolute. "We need to show strength, but we also need to show compassion. I'll speak to them, and we'll find a way to restore order." Rachel hesitated. "Are you sure? You've already made a statement. Another speech might make it worse." "I'm not just making a speech," the mayor said, his voice firm. "I'm taking control. We're going to end this before it gets any worse." The mayor's second speech was scheduled for the evening, just as the protests were reaching their peak. The streets were packed with people, their faces a mix of anger, fear, and determination. The air was thick with tension, and the police were on high alert, trying to manage the swelling crowd. As the mayor wheeled onto the stage, the noise from the crowd grew louder, a sea of voices calling for justice, for change. He took a deep breath before addressing them, his voice amplified through the speakers. "I know that many of you are angry," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And I understand that. What happened in that park was wrong. But I also know that the violence we're seeing now is not the answer." The crowd quieted, but the tension remained. The mayor could feel the weight of their eyes on him, their judgment, their expectation. "We cannot let this city be torn apart by hate. We cannot let fear and anger control us. We are better than this. We are stronger than this." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others still skeptical. The mayor knew that this wasn't going to be easy. But he also knew that he couldn't back down now. He had to push forward. "I will not stand by and let this city fall into chaos," he continued, his voice rising. "We will restore order. We will bring justice. But we will do it together. We will rise above this." For a moment, the crowd was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, a chant began to rise from the back of the crowd. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The chant spread, growing louder, more unified. The mayor's heart pounded in his chest. This was what he needed: unity, strength, resolve. But just as the chant reached its peak, something shifted in the crowd. A group of protesters near the front began to push forward, shouting and waving signs. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the police officers positioned along the perimeter of the crowd tensed, their hands on their batons. Suddenly, a bottle was thrown from the crowd, landing just inches from the mayor. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the square. The crowd erupted into chaos. Shouts and screams filled the air as protesters clashed with counter-protesters. The police rushed in, trying to control the situation, but it was clear that things were spiraling out of control. The mayor's heart raced as he was quickly escorted off the stage. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur. This wasn't what he had planned. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Get him out of here," one of the security guards shouted, pulling him toward a waiting car. The mayor didn't resist, but his mind was elsewhere. The city was unraveling before his eyes, and he had no idea how to stop it. As the car sped away, the sound of sirens and shouting grew fainter, but the feeling of dread remained. The mayor had tried to take control, to show strength. But now, as the violence erupted in the streets, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made things worse. The storm had broken, and there was no telling what would happen next. The city was on the edge of collapse. What had started as a protest against hate had spiraled into an all-out battle for control. The streets were filled with chaos, angry crowds clashing with the police, buildings damaged, and fires burning in the distance. The mayor's attempt to restore order had failed. The storm he had tried to calm had only grown fiercer. In the days following the failed speech, the mayor was bombarded with messages. The public's opinion of him had shifted, with many now questioning his leadership. His office was flooded with calls from concerned citizens, politicians, and even his closest allies. But none of it mattered. The damage had been done. The city was divided, and the trust he had worked so hard to build was crumbling. The mayor sat alone in his office, his face drawn and pale. His wheelchair, once a symbol of his strength, now felt like a prison. He had never felt more powerless. He had tried to do what was right, but now it seemed like everything was falling apart. His dog lay quietly at his feet, sensing the tension in the air. Rachel entered the room, her face grim. She had been working tirelessly to manage the situation, but even she was beginning to feel the weight of the unrest. "We have a problem," she said, her voice low. "The violence is escalating. We've had reports of armed groups roaming the streets. People are starting to take matters into their own hands." The mayor closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He had known this could happen, but the reality of it was harder to face than he had anticipated. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel hesitated. "We need to make a final stand. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything. The city is on the brink of civil unrest. But it's not just about the protests anymore. There are forces at work trying to tear this city apart. We need to expose them." The mayor looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You're talking about the people behind the scenes, aren't you?" Rachel nodded. "The ones who are pulling the strings. The ones who have been stoking the flames of division. We need to reveal them to the public. Show everyone who's behind this chaos." The mayor took a deep breath. It was a dangerous move, but he knew it was the only option left. If they didn't act now, the city would be lost forever. "Let's do it," he said, his voice firm. "We'll go public. We'll expose everything." The plan was set into motion quickly. Rachel and the mayor's team worked around the clock, gathering evidence and preparing a statement. The mayor knew that revealing the truth could bring the city back from the brink, but it was also a gamble. There were powerful people involved, people who wouldn't hesitate to fight back. But he had no choice. He had to fight for the city he loved, even if it meant risking everything. The mayor was scheduled to address the public once again, but this time it wasn't just about a speech. It was about exposing the truth. As he wheeled onto the stage, the air was thick with anticipation. The crowd was smaller than before, but the tension was palpable. The police were on high alert, and the mayor's security detail was tighter than ever. The mayor took a deep breath before speaking. "I've come before you today not just as your mayor, but as a citizen of this city," he began, his voice steady but resolute. "What we've seen in the past few days is not just a protest. It's an attempt to divide us, to tear us apart. But I won't let that happen." The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on him. The mayor continued, his words calculated but powerful. There are those among us who have been using this unrest to further their own agenda. They've been manipulating the anger and fear of the people for their own gain. But today I will expose them. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the crowd. The mayor motioned for his team to release the evidence. A video played on the large screens behind him, showing hidden footage of meetings between powerful figures, politicians, businessmen, and even some members of law enforcement, all conspiring to use the protests as a means to destabilize the city for their own benefit. The video sent shockwaves through the crowd. People gasped, some shouted in disbelief, others stood frozen in shock. The mayor watched the reaction carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. "These are the people who have been using us," he said, his voice rising. "They've been feeding us lies, using our anger to divide us. But we won't let them win. We will rise above this. We will take back our city." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some cheered, others shouted in anger. The truth had been exposed, but now the question was what would happen next. Would the people rally together, or would the divisions only deepen? The mayor's heart raced as he watched the crowd react. He knew that this was the turning point. The storm was still raging, but now there was a chance to calm it. A chance to heal the city. But just as the mayor was about to leave the stage, a group of masked individuals rushed forward, throwing bottles and shouting insults. The police quickly moved in, but the violence was spreading again. The mayor was hurriedly escorted off the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. The fight was far from over. As he was driven away, the sounds of chaos filled the air. The city was on the brink of something irreversible, and the mayor knew that no matter how hard he fought, the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the battle for the soul of the city had just begun.